Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thank you for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're very privileged to be joined by Elizabeth Hinton, professor at Yale University. Elizabeth is from Ann Arbor, went to graduate school, went to undergrad at NYU, graduate school at Columbia. She's taught at the University of Michigan, at Harvard and Yale. She's known as an amazing researcher, a great writer, and a wonderful teacher. I've read stories of long lines going out her door during non-COVID time. So it's just every place she's gone has been just an amazing and well-respected teacher. She's also a great writer. She wrote a book in 2016 called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, and is coming out with a book in about a month called America on Fire, the Untold Story of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s. I actually have a copy of it right here. I read The Galleys. It's an amazing book that will really challenge our perceptions of American history, certainly recent American history. And particularly for those of us in Southern Illinois right now, or in Illinois, Illinois looms large in this book in ways that we don't probably feel terribly proud about, but this book gives us some really important insights into really the history of Illinois in the last half century. So with that, I want to say hello to Elizabeth.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction and for having me, and to the audience for tuning in.
Great. Well, Elizabeth, let's start out at sort of the beginning. You grew up in Ann Arbor, and as I read about you, you seem to have an amazing family. Your mom is a therapist and a writer. Your dad played pro football, was an art professor at the University of Michigan. I think you have two siblings. Tell us about growing up in Ann Arbor, and particularly as it's sort of the evolution of your intellectual interests.
Yeah, so Ann Arbor was a really, I think, important site for me in terms of understanding the world and also understanding the kind of limitations of liberal social policy. I mean, for one, I'm biracial and come from a mixed race family. My dad's family most of his family was located in Saginaw, Michigan, which was about an hour and a half away, about 40 minutes north of Flint, Michigan, which more people are familiar with, but another auto town. So that side of the family, kind of a strong Michigan story of auto workers and a migration in the post-war period from Georgia. And my dad, because of his football skills, was able to get out, one of the only people in his family who did, and received a full scholarship to the University of Iowa. And so that really changed the trajectory of my immediate family and his branch of the family. So it was really clear to me growing up when we would go to visit my family in Saginaw, that just the differences between the resources that I had access to in Ann Arbor and the resources that I had access to as the child of, two parents who had, gone up to receive graduate level education in a college town versus Saginaw, which, I was born in the mid 80s. By the 80s and 90s, really deteriorated alongside plant closings and, of course, increasing poverty and crack and drug abuse. And so this really kind of shaped my understanding of the world, but also inequality and the ways in which resources and material conditions really can shape outcomes for generations. And I think Ann Arbor is, as a college town, it's very proud of itself for being this kind of like liberal bastion and safe space. But for me, I think especially, growing up as a mixed kid in Ann Arbor, I found it to be, a deeply, deeply racist place in a number of ways. And so, even as it was seen as this great liberal space, it had within the public schools a really, really deep, what people were saying then, achievement gap. And now I think we're thinking about it more as an opportunity gap between Black and white students. Ann Arbor is an extremely segregated city with a very, very small Black middle class. And despite all of the kind of like rhetoric towards inclusion and diversity and celebrating difference, in practice, we were seeing a horrible tracking system within the Ann Arbor public schools, and deep poverty within segregated Black communities there, despite the affluence in the area. And so I think that this, the kind of difference between the rhetoric and the reality of liberal policy, and also the difference between my upbringing in Ann Arbor versus Saginaw really shaped my own interests and my own set of historical questions. And also, I think my critique of the limits of liberal social policy that really comes through in my first book when I'm discussing the war on poverty and the Johnson administration. I think a lot of that came from my own background growing up in Ann Arbor.
And then you studied historical sociology at NYU, and particularly looking at African Americans and mass incarceration. Is that sort of the essence of what your focus?
So I wasn't as interested at NYU. I mostly, I came from this kind of a real Black studies tradition that engaged deeply with the Black radical tradition. I worked with, this was when Robin D.G. Kelley, famed historian of the Black freedom struggle and resistance and racial capitalism, was teaching at NYU. When I researched for him, I was very, very influenced by his work. And I went to this school at NYU called the Gallatin School of Individualized Study, where you could kind of create your own major. And I was really interested in the history of Black social movements and the history and questions about, how social change is created, in the context of, again, these kind of larger questions about trying to understand how the inequalities in the U.S. and the Caribbean. I was in some ways much more transnationally focused in undergrad than a lot of my work in my historical work in graduate school has been. But how did we kind of get these racial divisions and racial inequalities that we see in our society, and how did people resist those conditions and build really vibrant social movements to challenge them?
And then your mom is a therapist and a writer, and actually had written a book on one of the kind of notorious gangs in LA, the Crips. And as I understood it, maybe in an earlier phase in her career as a social worker, had done some work with prisoners and so forth. Did that inform your development, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, these issues had always been, it did. And I think that understanding, my mom's work, she co-authored a memoir with Colton Simpson, who was a member of the Crips in Los Angeles. And I think that meeting Colton kind of expanded, my understanding of gang violence in the late 20th century. But, issues of crime and punishment and prisons were always something that I was fascinated by, and were kind of hotly debated in my household. I mean, in part because, especially during the 90s, I had family members who were getting arrested and going to prison. So this was something that was playing out in my family. And I was very, I was kind of coming of age into my adolescence during the OJ trial. And I was just absolutely gripped by the OJ trial as well, and kind of the criminal justice system in general. And I remember, like, me and my dad watched a lot of it, and we watched it and talked about it in my house. And, I was debating at that point too. I mean, this goes back to the kind of landscape of Ann Arbor, but I would get into debates with my schoolmates in middle school and elementary school about Black crime. People would make comments about that rested on sets of assumptions about Black people being inherently violent and criminal. And I would always kind of push back on that. And that pushing back came from discussions at the dinner table with my parents. And, my mom had worked in the 1970s in women's prisons in Michigan, and continued to talk about that and those experiences. My dad was the University of Michigan has a really vibrant prisoners arts program that my dad was, as a professor at the art school, was involved with. So, these were issues that were always really important to my family. And I think that the fact that, they were discussed frequently during my childhood, helped me understand why they're important. And when my family members started getting incarcerated, Even though I felt there was a degree of shame that I felt about that, I kind of understood it, or knew that it was related to something that was larger than the charges that they were arrested for.
Well, in a profile I read of you, describes a really kind of a transformative experience. I think it was 2005, where maybe you and your mom had gone to California to visit a relative in prison, and just, I mean, it seemed like, this brutal trip. You flew to Reno, like a 5-hour drive. You go to this awful prison. You see the racial composition of the prison. You see the dynamic of prisoners' families, and at one point you just sort of said, "My God, how did we get to this place?" Talk about that experience as kind of triggering.
Yeah, so this was in 2005, 2006, and this was before mass incarceration was the kind of buzzword that it is now. This is before we were really talking about mass incarceration, and I will say, I think that moment really began in terms of like a public dialogue about the issue with Michelle Alexander's groundbreaking book, The New Jim Crow. When that was released in 2010, I think that it opened up new conversations about the design of these policies, and the ways that that racism is a kind of like inherent part of crime control policies in the criminal legal system in the U.S. So this was a couple of years before that, when I don't think that we had a sense of the scale, or really were talking about the conditions in prison. And so, when I first went to High Desert State Prison in Susanville, California, and you go through the process where the guards criminalize family members and visitors themselves. So you go through that. Stepping into the visiting room, I mean, I was just so struck by the generations of mostly Black and brown men with their wives and young children who were behind bars. And it was just to actually, be in the room, to be there with family, to be unable to, interact normally, to be able to hug and touch. You can only do that at the beginning of the visit and at the end. All of these things, I just leaving that experience made me, I think, even more angry, and to want to understand how we got here. How did we get to these generations of Black and brown men being confined in far away, remote places, in these little rural prison towns, and that to me, that seemed like, even though at the time historians weren't asking these questions, to me that seemed like a historical question, and not one that was about the 1990s, or about I think what is still a really dominant interpretation, which is that we Black and brown people are disproportionately incarcerated because they're naturally more violent, and so this reflects that fact, and they're getting arrested more frequently, and they go to prison, like it's somehow part of the natural order, instead of being the outcome of a historical process. And so I wanted to explore that, and to try to explain how this happened in the United States, in the land of the free.
Well, let's go to the first book, from the war on poverty to the war on crime, and I think the war on poverty is typically dated to LBJ's first, his State of the Union address, I think in January '64, just about a month after JFK was killed, and yet the war on crime begins about a year later. So so many questions flow from that. Did they really give it a shot? How did we get diverted from this ambitious and seemingly idealistic war on poverty to this pretty brutal war on crime? What happened?
That's a great question, and it's a tough one, and it's one that was surprising to me when I began this research. So, leaving High Desert and starting to think about what a research project would look like, I did not expect that the origins of that visiting room were to be found in the Johnson or Kennedy even administrations, were to be found in the 1960s. And so that's the big irony, that the moment at the height of the civil rights revolution and progressive social change, we also get this war on crime that Johnson declared, which people weren't, when I began this research, people weren't really talking about at all. The fact that Lyndon Johnson broke with the previous 200 years of American history and established for the first time a role for the federal government in local police operations, and in prisons and court systems. And so, kind of wrestling with that is something that that question is really at the heart of From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. So the question is why? I mean, my sense, and this is in some ways related to my second book, right? Well, okay, let's step back. There's a long trajectory in American history that every time rights are extended to people, that the bounds of citizenship expand, particularly for African Americans, there's a subsequent clampdown and new criminal laws and new forms of incarceration emerge. So we see this immediately after emancipation. Civil War is fought, 4 million slaves are freed, and almost immediately Southern states begin to enact Black codes, basically leading to the arrest of newly freed people on seemingly arbitrary charges, like not being employed by a white person, and bringing them into exploiting the loophole in the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery except for punishment of a crime, and bringing people into the emerging convict lease system, which was, essentially the labor regime of the, developed by the New South industrialists to modernize the South after the fall of slavery. And so this leads to kind of the first, a much smaller scale, but the first mass incarceration in America immediately after slavery. You flash forward 100 years later, 1964, we had the Voting Rights Act. 1965, Johnson calls the War on Crime 1 week before sending the Voting Rights Act to Congress, which completes his civil rights package. So again, we're seeing this, the fall of Jim Crow, the expansion of the bounds of citizenship, and then a new war on crime. So in part, it reflects this kind of larger tendency in U.S. history. I think the other response is a kind of carrot and stick approach that both the Kennedy and Johnson administration took to deal with the demographic changes that occurred in the post-war period, the fact that many cities were getting Blacker, that DC had come into a Black majority. Cities like Detroit and Cincinnati, we're coming into a third or close to Black majorities. And policymakers said, okay, wow, there are all these Black people in cities, middle class and white people have left to the suburbs. There are all these Black youth. There aren't jobs for them. What are we going to do? We need some kind of intervention because they're going to explode. Officials in the Kennedy administration called Black youth social dynamite in the early 60s. This was, before the era of rebellion because of that kind of fear of explosion. And so, both administrations developed a kind of social welfare and punitive intervention to figure out how to manage this problem. And for, in the Kennedy administration, that was a comprehensive juvenile delinquency program that ended up being kind of the blueprint for the war on poverty. So during Kennedy, the early Head Start programs, the early remedial education programs were part of a juvenile delinquency program, which is really, interesting now when thinking about how limited our ideas of crime prevention are. The Kennedy administration's crime prevention program was an attack on poverty. It said, okay, the root causes of crime are social conditions. This is what Lloyd Olin and Richard Cloward and social scientists who were influential in the Kennedy administration believed. And they said, okay, let's if we want to control crime, we've got to invest resources into communities. We've got to give people job opportunities. So Johnson took that aspect of the Kennedy juvenile delinquency program and made it into the war on poverty. And then he launched a separate war on crime, which really in the early years was about militarizing local police forces in the event of a rebellion, in the event that Black people, the social dynamite would explode and start, attacking police officers and looting stores and setting fires. And, it's important that Johnson declares the war on crime 1 year, in the spring, a year after the kind of first set of social dynamite exploding in the summer of 64, beginning in Harlem. And the last thing I'll say about this is that, in Ferguson, after the uprisings surrounding Michael Brown's killing by a Ferguson police officer, we saw all of these like tanks and armored vehicles and heavily dressed and militarized police officers on the scene. And there's like kind of the sense like, whoa, I mean, that was another, like, how did this happen? How are these police forces so militarized? And a lot of people said, this is because of the technology transfers that began in the War on Terror, and this is a 21st century thing. But again, we had to understand that process. We have to go back to the 60s, because to fight urban rebellion at home, Johnson calls the war on crime, creates this new role for the federal government and new investments in local police. Initially, the war on crime was really, really focused on enhancing the kind of weapons arsenal and surveillance capabilities and sheer number of urban police officers. And an important component of that was technology transfers from, weapons that were being used in Vietnam and interventions in the Dominican Republic to, the LAPD, the NYPD, Chicago PD, and other big city police forces.
Well, this is kind of a good context to come to your current book, because I'd like to talk, in a few minutes about Illinois and a couple of communities in particular, but let's look at kind of the broader argument. And I want to just read a couple of sentences you wrote and just have you kind of expand on it. You say between 1964 and 1972, but especially between 68 and 72, the United States endured internal violence on a scale not seen since the Civil War. Every major urban center burned during those 8 years. And then a little bit further, you say the so-called urban riots from the 1960s to the present can only be properly understood as rebellions. These events did not represent a wave of criminality, but a sustained insurgency. The violence was in response to moments of tangible racism, almost always taking the form of a police encounter. Yet tens of thousands of Black Americans who participated in this collective violence were not rebelling just against police brutality. They were also rebelling against a broader system that entrenched unequal conditions and anti-Black violence over generations. Sorry to read so much, but it's wonderfully written. And just so go from there.
Okay, so I'm going to try to break this up, and that's such an important question. So if I end up missing anything, please, keep on nudging me. So first, let's talk about just like the sheer, what you opened with, which is the kind of the sheer extent of rebellion. And one thing that I'm really proud of in the book is my numbers are based on data that the political scientist Christian Davenport at the Radical Information Project, the University of Michigan Center for Political Studies, gathered based on this amazing archive from the Lemberg Center for the Study of Violence that formed immediately after John F. Kennedy's assassination to kind of just basically chart and record the extent of violence in the U.S. And so, the Lemberg Center, in that archive, it's not just Black rebellion, but it's student revolts, it's labor strike, but it's all these news clippings from local papers that we really couldn't get anywhere else. And so Christian, happened to come into the archive in his possession and began to quantify, not just Black rebellions, but all of this kind of violence. The Lemberg Center did this tracking from the early 60s to 72. So, one thing that again, another kind of like surprise when I began doing this research is just how much, the narrative was, and this is something that I kind of was guilty of advancing in my first book, is that, the rebellion, 64 happens, the rebellions peak with Detroit and Newark in 67, Martin Luther King is assassinated, there's another wave, and then they just kind of stopped. And the Lemberg Center data shows that, and that they did not stop in 68. In fact, they grew much more prevalent. So we go from, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but you'll see in the book. If
I have a few, Elizabeth, I mean, it goes from like 504 in 68 to 614 in 69, 630 in 70, 319 in 71.
Right. So instead of decreasing, well into the late 60s and early 70s, these incidents are actually increasing. And it's as I see it, it's in direct response to, I mentioned, So Johnson calls the war on crime in 65, and there's like a smaller kind of experimental program that begins these technology transfers and begins these pilot programs that militarize police and improve police patrol capabilities until 1968, when we get the first major piece of law enforcement legislation that really kind of starts the war on crime on a national scale. And so, in many ways, I saw this kind of increase in rebellion as being in direct response, as being an important measure of community response to the war on crime itself. And so, I mentioned the kind of data because, without the Lemberg archive and without Christian Davenport's work on this, I wouldn't have been able to one, find the local newspapers clippings to be able to access these stories. Like the Peoria story, that was in Lemberg, and it would have been nearly impossible to find unless I was, got a hunch or a lead from somebody. And so that archive is one that's really special. So I think your second question was about kind of why.
Well, just even maybe play on the notion of rebellion versus riot and the importance of the nomenclature.
Right. Okay. So immediately, in 64, when Harlem rises up, Johnson says this is a criminal act. This has nothing to do with civil rights. This is a riot. And in framing it as a riot, policymakers respond as if these incidents are just fundamentally criminal, and therefore the only response to these incidents is more police and more surveillance in the communities that are rebellion. But if you look at what we know that the participants themselves were saying, and we actually situate many of these rebellions in part as the outgrowth of a lack of change as a result of nonviolent direct action protests. There are histories in all of these communities. I mean, there's a national history right with the civil rights movement. Rebellion also is occurring in a moment when the Black freedom movement is becoming increasingly militant, and groups like the Black Panthers are advocating for armed self-defense and a violent revolutionary, even in the Panthers case, response to social conditions, material conditions that they see as violent. So this is part of a kind of increasing sense among especially young Black people that nonviolent protests had failed to secure jobs for people. I think fundamentally that was what both the civil rights movement and the rebellions were about: jobs, underemployment, unemployment, decent housing, educational opportunities, and a well-resourced educational system. And at base, in some senses, to not be treated like a second-class citizen. And I think for this new generation, the civil rights movement had not secured those, had not seemed to secure those aims, and the grievances that communities had that led them to rebel were shared by the mainstream civil rights movement. Again, employment, jobs, an end to police brutality. And so instead of kind of in labeling this form of protest as something that's criminal, and therefore seeing kind of policing or crime control as being the only response, we fail time and time again to actually see the root cause of why people rebel in the first place. So that's one of the reasons why language is really important, and why I think that calling, the tendency to call these incidents riots, both doesn't speak to the political motivations that many participants have, that we know, the demands that many participants made both during and after rebellion. And it also prevents a different set of responses that would, hopefully lead us to prevent these incidents and these interactions between residents and police from happening in the first place. I mean, I think one last thing that I'll say, and this was captured partly in the quote. I mean, the rebellions in the 60s and the rebellions that we see sprouting up and, directly after that Safe Streets Act is passed in June 68, are really in response to the policing of ordinary and everyday activity, which was a former strategy of the war on crime. Johnson and other policymakers, as they developed the National Crime Control Program, premised it, most of it on kind of future crime and potential criminals, with the assumption that that certain communities are latently criminal, and that the best way to prevent crime is to, have police intervene or make arrests before it occurs. And so this leads to, the over policing of housing projects, the breaking up of gatherings and parties, and the initial response to that in Black communities, as these new strategies were being widely implemented, was to usually begin throwing rocks at the police officers and say, no, we're not going to take this. And over the course of the 20th century, that the response to that kind of policing ends up evolving. But I think, this is the story of rebellion is a really important way for us to think about how communities how community members themselves are responding to these new national law enforcement measures.
Well, let's be very specific. A community that you know well and is familiar with people here, Cairo. And I mean, your account of it is utterly gripping, vivid beyond almost description. Tell us how you learned about this story, and also how you pieced it together from your research.
Thank you so much for asking that question. Yeah, so what I will say about Cairo too is that it's the depiction of Cairo in the Lemberg archive was really skewed. And so, I mean, just like much of the coverage of Cairo was. And so, initially when I came across the clippings in Lemberg, it was basically this armed group of Black residents in a housing project in Cairo were going around and shooting up white people and shooting up the police station and doing all these things. And I thought that was interesting, and that was kind of unique in terms of, the way that rebellion was both reported on, but also the content. And I also noticed that this seemed to be a sustained form of resistance. And so then when I started doing more research on it, I realized that the story was much more complicated. I was able to come across a really rich archive that contained letters from United Front leader Charles Cohen, who was a really kind of prominent freedom fighter in Cairo, to the Urban League, and a pamphlet that was put together that Resident Robert Sutherland was involved in, that kind of depicted the protests in Cairo, the boycott of white-owned businesses there. I mean, Cairo was essentially a town that was nearly majority Black. It was Black residents were just under half of the population, and because of the way that that political power and elections there worked had no political power, they were locked out essentially of decent employment opportunities, any employment opportunities in the city, decent housing. The city was segregated, and on top of it, through the course of the 1960s, as Black residents in Cairo began to demand rights, in all the arenas that we've been talking about, the forces of white supremacy and vigilantism really rose there, really mobilized in response, and were deeply entwined with the police department to kind of terrorize the community and even more. And a coalition of organizations, many of them religious organizations in Cairo, came together under the United Front in the late 60s and began to organize for economic power, and also began to fight back. And so in many ways, when I really started to get into the resources on Cairo, and I will say too, there's a wonderful book that was really helpful in helping me kind of figure out the terrain, and that is Faith in Black Power by Carrie Pinblot. And when I really started to get into the history, it was just it's haunting to me. It was haunting in many ways. It's in a it's an American horror story of oppression and the ways in which white establishment in Carroll's place, essentially let the political and economic sectors of the town die due to their own racism. And so, I just became fascinated with the story of the town because, especially in the context, as the site of, both one of the longest boycotts in American history, Black residents in Cairo began to boycott white businesses downtown under the premise too, because they were being shot up by many of the white vigilantes nearly every night. Well, we're not going to patronize these businesses so these white vigilantes can buy bullets to shoot at us, and we're going to defend our communities. That boycott lasted for a number of years, as did the violence in Cairo. And so, in many ways, it's this kind of exceptional example of racial inequality, racial inequality, discriminatory policing, and the relationship between policing and white supremacist organizations. It's exceptional in many ways, but it's also indicative and very reflective of the United States as a whole. And I think, activists in Cairo at the time saw that struggle as being one that was both exceptional and deeply reflected. And I think it seemed impossible for me to write this book without telling that really important story that I don't think has gotten, and even in my book, I haven't given that story its fair shake. Carrie Pinblot's book is fantastic, but I think in many ways, the story of Cairo was key to the U.S., understanding the U.S. in the late 20th century, and also understanding the forces of white racism. The fact that some of the things that happened in Cairo were happening in the 1970s. That's part of what was, people still in 1970s, white people sicking German shepherds on young kids and, literally just shooting up into Black neighborhoods with impunity. This was, it seems like it felt like the 1950s Mississippi, but it wasn't. And I think we don't have a sense of just, and hopefully we'll begin to ask these questions now, I think, especially in light of January 6th, but we don't have a sense of just how pervasive and enduring white supremacy has been, and its relationship to law enforcement, which we see very clearly in Cairo.
Well, in one story you tell too, I think it was in '62 when there was an effort to integrate maybe the public swimming pool, and the owners basically closed it down, cemented it up, and you called it kind of a monument to racism.
Right. And this is rather than, again, it really shows white resistance, rather than actually, integrate, the decision on the part of that business owner was simply to close the pool, and the politicians in Cairo and state officials, nobody was really willing to continue to fight to challenge that, to keep it open. And so that was what it was. And again, this is happening in '62. Schools in Cairo don't integrate until the late 1960s. And when they do, many white parents take their kids out of the public schools and put them into Camelot. Again, we think of like 54 as being that moment. And Cairo, the story of Cairo reminds us that, it's a very long process, and that white families continue to resist. That story of pulling kids out of public schools and putting them into new private ones is again, we see, especially in southern states, a response to forced integration in the late 60s and 70s.
It's interesting, Elizabeth, when reading your book, you see, the country making so many wrong turns, and you point out that there were some people who saw clearly a different way. And you quote Sarge Shriver, who was President Kennedy's brother-in-law, who worked for President Johnson, writing a note to Johnson, basically saying, the Negroes, for all their destructiveness, I can see, but these riots as terrible calls. The Negroes want access to the fruits of participating in citizenship, the opportunity to both earn and to control their destiny. And then also one good part of Illinois was the Kerner Commission that, the former governor from Illinois put together, that he was chair of, that saw a different way, that said, if we invest in quality of life, that maybe we can address some of these urban ills. Talk about those missed opportunities.
Yeah. And I'll also say, with respect to Cairo, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission holds a series of hearings that occur basically at the end of the violence. But this is like the only real intervention that people of Carroll get. And again, I mean, we see in all these commissions, and this is another thing that I deal with from the book, from Kerner on down. I mean, Kerner is obviously the most prominent one, but in the aftermath of rebellion, you know, either local or state level human rights commissions, or in the case of places like Carroll, where you know, local human rights commission in that city did not exist, and the state was not going to bring one there. The federal government intervened. You know, continued to emphasize the socioeconomic causes of violence and proposed a set of solutions. And last thing I'll say about Carroll before moving to Kerner, but I think it is kind of a larger metaphor for the shortcomings of many of these commissions. You know, in '72, the Carroll Commission, which was chaired by a Black woman who was the first, her name is escaping me, which is inexcusable, but the first Black woman to serve on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And they basically said, okay, you know, first step that needs to happen here is the police department needs to formally distance themselves from the white vigilante groups operating in this city, you know, while acknowledging the need for jobs and economic opportunities and integrated housing, because public housing in Carroll in the 70s was still really segregated, and the ways in which the opening of that private school I mentioned really drained resources from the public schools. Said first thing, you know, we've got to cut this relationship between the police and the vigilantes. And, you know, by the mid 70s, even that step still had not been taken. So in many ways, like the Kerner Commission, these commissions, you know, tell us what's wrong and how to get out of it. And then people don't listen. And that's one of the most frustrating things. I mean, I will say, you know, I don't think now too, like the solution to inequality, the inequality that we're seeing today is not another commission. We know what the problem is. I think we can go back to the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission had a really bold vision for what American society could be and should be, and what domestic policies should look like. I mean, the Kerner Commission essentially said the war on poverty is a good thing, but it hasn't gone far enough. And this is why, in the context of the war on poverty, we're continuing to see the escalation of rebellion. What is needed is, you know, a massive job creation program that's kind of advanced by both the public and private sector for low-income Americans and racially marginalized Americans in particular, and a massive investment of resources, essentially like a Marshall Plan for American cities, that's going to help make under-resourced communities really, really vibrant, vital places. You know, basically, like, if we want to stop rebellion, we've got to, you know, give people the resources that they've been asking for. And, you know, one of, again, the tragedies or ironies of the Kerner Commission's report is that, you know, it also included a number of police reforms, you know, some of them very progressive, some of them things that are still debated and not fully implemented today, different approaches to stop and frisks, and you know, citizen review boards and citizen patrols and all kinds of a public safety that really sought to involve community members, and an emphasis on the investigation of violent crimes and crimes that were directly, you know, harmful to people and property. It also, you know, in many ways upheld some of the logics of the war on crime. And so the only recommendations that were actually implemented, the only recommendations of the Kerner Commissions that went into national legislation, you know, were the ones that advanced another commission that Johnson had convened in the mid-60s, which is the Crime Commission's emphasis on new policing and patrol strategies in urban communities. So, you know, we have known what the solutions are for a really long time. And again, I think in part in refusing to really wrestle with the violent conditions themselves that lead to rebellion, we have prevented this nation from seeing, you know, from seeing these bold solutions to inequality and violence outside of policing and incarceration. And that's one of the real, I think, tragedies of this moment, and, you know, why cities in 2020 continue to burn. I mean, until we solve these problems of inequality, until police and incarceration are no longer kind of at the forefront of managing the consequences of poverty and inequality, we're going to keep seeing these incidents of police violence, and we're going to keep seeing communities rising up in anger and despair and frustration in response. I mean, not just to the violent incidents themselves, but to the inequality and the racism around them.
Well, let's talk about the current moment. In your book, towards your conclusion, brings us up to the summer of 2020. This massive outpouring of outrage, and you call the largest social justice movement in American history. And since in this last year, I mean, we've seen state legislatures, including in Illinois, pass criminal justice packages. There's been a broader discussion of systemic racism. New Democratic president, Democratic majority in Congress passed a $1.9 trillion Rescue Act that some say has a kernel of a lot of really progressive policies. There's been articles about this new infusion of funds into historically Black colleges. Well, how do all these come together in your mind as to where we are going?
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways that remains to be seen, although I do think, I mean, it seems like the Biden administration is on a trajectory that's looking more like the approach to governance and social problems and federalism that we saw during the Johnson administration, which I think is promising and important, and we need it desperately in this moment. My students are always shocked whenever I tell them, and it's true that, like Richard Nixon was the last, liberal president in some ways. Nixon was far to the left of Obama, actually talked about a guaranteed minimum income. And, Nixon is, I'm not a Nixon apologist. I'm not trying to celebrate Nixon, but that's the reality. We have had this kind of this strong rightward shift that has led to all of these disinvestments from the very programs that we've been talking about that need to be invested in, a real retrenchment from social welfare programs and a real withdrawal, frankly, of social programs and government programs from low-income communities outside of policing programs. So, I think all of this and the illiberalism or illogic of mass incarceration, especially in a democracy, and the resources, the fact that in many states, governments spend more taxpayer dollars on incarcerating people than on educating them. The fact that, maintaining the largest prison system on the planet and a mass incarceration society has created a huge drain on resources and has exacerbated inequality. I mean, I think, all of these things are kind of coming together in many ways in this moment. And, COVID, in the context of COVID, because I don't think, I don't know. It's difficult. I mean, we can't, right, separate the protests of 2020 from the context of the COVID pandemic for a number of reasons. But I do think that, what COVID did was kind of unmask and the disparities within, those who are susceptible to the virus and treatment for the virus, and the kind of, again, the systemic racism within healthcare and within the kind of employment economy, who's working where. All of this, COVID kind of unmasks this virus, or is a virus that unmasks all these other viruses, including American racism, that we're now kind of forced to confront, and that the people have forced policymakers to confront in new ways by rising up against the very, 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 very blatant forms of injustice. And so, and this Joe Biden does figure prominently into a lot of my work, and certainly in my first book, as, being one of the architects of mass incarceration and the harsh drug policies that we saw enacted in the 80s and 90s. I mean, Joe Biden was a big, crime warrior, and was the sponsor of the 1994 crime bill, which is probably after the 1960, after the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, those two pieces of legislation by two Democratic presidents who are seen by many as liberal are like the two key pieces of legislation to helping us understand how we got here. The 94 crime bill under Clinton, really led to the explosion in prison populations that we saw in the 90s directly. And, Joe Biden was at the helm of that. So, I think I'm cautiously optimistic, but I do think that we can no longer continue on the punitive path that we have been. We need a different set of investments. We need protection of our basic voting rights. I mean, I think that's like one of the things now. I don't discuss this directly in my work, but I'm, again, it's just related to some of the dynamics that we saw in Cairo, that I write about in Cairo. Like, what are white people, the lengths that the white establishment will go to retain their power and prevent, racially marginalized populations from having access to the franchise and their basic citizenship rights. We see this playing out again and again. And so, I hope that our elected officials who are committed to committed to democracy, first of all, and a different vision of what America is, in this moment that's so necessary, will help bring those necessary policies to the fore.
Great. Elizabeth, we have a few questions that have been emailed in, and there's some great ones. We have Bill from Chicago wondering about historical data and evidence for how we treat people who've been incarcerated. I know you're really passionate about prisoner education. Are there some models for what we can do to get these people, to help them leave and to help them be on a strong path once they get out of prison?
That's such a good question. And let me first direct you to a new book that just came out that's really amazing. It's called Halfway Home. It's by Reuben Jonathan Miller, who's at the University of Chicago. And he's kind of the, one of the nation's experts. He's a sociologist, but on reentry and reentry programs. So if you're looking for a deeper dive, I think that's one book that is that would be, great for anyone who's interested. I think part of it, and this is true for, bringing about the kind of changes I'm talking about, it's going to take a real transformation in our worldview. And part of it is, rethinking our justice system as one that's based on repair instead of retribution, and believing that people who harm other people or who commit crimes really deserve second chances, and that that we can provide people who have harmed others, many of whom are victims themselves, many of whom have been victims of forms of harm or violence, that we can provide them with resources that they need to actually be able to participate in society in a different way and no longer cause harm. I mean, part of it is like breaking the the cycle of harm, again, because so many people who have harmed others have been harmed themselves. And so, like one approach that I think about is, instead of, and this is a later 20th century development, but the way that we responded to gang violence, and the kind of the idea of a super predator that really took off in the mid-90s during that crime bill moment. But looking at like young 12 and 14-year-olds, people like Colton Simpson, who was involved in the Crip gang in Los Angeles, who were, essentially entrepreneurs, and saying, okay, you clearly, have a kind of business savvy and you're interested in things and you're doing math and all kind. So let's invest a set of resources in you, so that you're not, seemingly having to participate in this informal economy and the violence that's attached to it. I mean, so much of it is just like how we respond to things, and how we respond to things in certain communities, like, the response of opioid abuse in white communities as a public health problem, but crack abuse in Black communities as a criminal problem. So for me, part of, and as an educator at a university, part of the, I don't just do this work to have these conversations, although I I really enjoy these conversations, and they're really important to have. But I do this work to hopefully actually make change. Both policy change in my research, but also, especially being at elite institutions like Harvard and Yale, how can I use the resources that I have to actually expand opportunities for people and deal with the problem of mass incarceration so that we can end it? I mean, that's, one of the things. Mass incarceration, I focus on federal policy makers in a lot of my work, but this is a problem that we've all been a part of creating. And so it's going to take all of us to creatively use what we can to get out of it. And so one of the things that I'm committed to as an educator are our education in prison programs, expanding educational opportunities for people who are in prison, and expanding educational opportunities for people once they're released. I think, education is really important, especially for people who are in prison, because, even more than race, the likelihood that you will serve time in prison at one point in your life is more deeply tied to education than anything else. So if you're a white man without a high school diploma, you are much more likely to go to prison at some point than a Black man with a high school diploma. And again, in thinking about responses, one way to look at this would be to say, we actually have an opportunity for people who are incarcerated, because this is on the whole, the most undereducated group of people in our society. And let's actually take this opportunity to get them the education that they deserve, so that when they come out, they can find, they can come to understand themselves better. They can come to participate in our democracy better, and they can get a job that's going to fulfill them according to their interests. And so again, as an educator, this is one thing that I can do to help our society deal with this problem and get out of it.
Charles from Hoffman Estates asked you to put the American incarceration system into an international perspective. Are there any other countries that are, approach this in any way resembling how we do it?
No, the U.S. is an outlier in every respect in terms of our system of incarceration. We are, no other industrialized nation incarcerates people like we do, under the harsh sentences that we do. Especially in the late 80s and 90s, we really began to over-rely on life without the possibility of parole sentences. And so the population of incarcerated people living under those sentences where they will never get out of prison is about 700,000, which is equivalent to the total number of the incarcerated population in Japan. So that just that kind of gives you a sense. And again, that decision to essentially sentence young, men in their late teens, early 20s to prison for life, and sometimes juveniles, to say you're irredeemable and never able to get out. Those are the people who now are in prison and more susceptible to COVID. That's another discussion. But so not only do we punish more harshly, and so it's not just about how we punish drug-related charges, but how we punish violent offenders as well. And it's also the conditions in prison, and the way that kind of prison discipline and segregation in prison is structured, really has and is designed to dehumanize people rather than, as we've been talking about, to truly rehabilitate people. A lot of, we often look at the prison system in Sweden or Denmark, or other European countries as kind of models. In some of these prisons, there are no uniforms. People can walk around freely. People can visit with their families and their children. These aren't rights that are extended to people who are incarcerated in the United States.
We have a number of questions, and this may be your next book, on reparations. And particularly from Illinois, there was a package passed in Evanston in the last week or so. What I know this is a huge topic and doesn't necessarily conduce to a quick answer, but what is your general sense of that?
Well, I think that question relates to what, what's been, I think, a running theme through our discussion, which is that, we need it. We can't, you can't, like, and people say this is the metaphor people use for affirmative action a lot. You can't, like, for somebody who started, a mile behind, you can't expect that they'll finish the race at the same time. Meaning, we have to invest resources in communities that have been systematically denied them for decades and centuries. And so I think, when I think about reparations, I'm not thinking about like an individual paycheck to people, but I'm thinking about a different way that we conceive domestic policies that account for injustices that various groups, of course, not just Black people in the United States have confronted. And that is going to take, redistributing resources. That's going to take most likely, completely changing our tax structure so that, the tax structure in the United States, especially in the late 20th century, has fell more heavily on poor and middle class people than the rich and wealthy. And that's one thing that can change to help create, a whole new swell of resources that can go into poor and low income communities that need them the most. So when I think about reparations, that's what I'm thinking about.
Well, I have to ask you this question. I hope it's not too personal, but you seem like such a joyful, exuberant person who, your research is in some of the most difficult and frankly infuriating topics one can imagine. I mean, you must have an amazing ability to compartmentalize. I mean, more broadly, how do you, and I was struck by just your writing because, I'm just thinking, man, how can Elizabeth write with such, I wouldn't say clinical, but it's just kind of a scholarly passion. I mean, you're obviously angry, but it doesn't distract your writing, or it's not polemical. So respond to those questions.
Yeah, I think I'm just, and this like goes back in some ways to what we talked about in the beginning. I mean, I've always been really passionate about injustices that I see. And I really, again, I do this work with the hope that it will lead to genuine change. And I think especially, with both books, I mean, I wrote my dissertation, I finished my dissertation in 2013, and then Ferguson happened. And as I was revising my dissertation into the book that became From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, I was just even more convinced that the work just needed to be out there. And so that just really fueled me. I think writing about these things in this moment has fueled me. With America on Fire, I had been sitting on the Lemberg archives in this research for so long and kind of unsure what to do with it. And then after 2020 and the protests, it just became something like the first book that was kind of larger than myself. I had done the research and it felt like it was so important. These stories were so important. They needed to be shared. And it was just something that kind of flew out of me passionately. I mean, I think too, with respect to America on Fire, this was, writing that book was the way that I coped with COVID and with the trauma of the 2020 election. So, in some ways I felt this urgency, like this was larger than me and really needed to be shared. And selfishly, it was, I think the passion in it is just kind of my sense of, and my frustration at everything that's happened in the past year. And, my greatest hope is that this work will lead to change, and that inspires me. I have a 2-year-old, almost 2-year-old daughter, and obviously I didn't give birth to her till my second book was well out into the world, but she continues to inspire me. And I do this to make a better America for all of us, but especially for her and for my grandkids. I don't want her to have to live in the America that I have and that we're seeing form today. And so what I can do, my skill set that I can contribute to that is the research and the writing and the teaching.
Well, let me ask you just as a writer question. I mean, do you say for a first draft, just kind of cut loose and just, say what's in you and then say, okay, in the second and third draft, I have to put a different tone on it? I was wondering just mechanically how you do it.
Yeah, I actually, that's exactly right. I consider myself more of an editor than a writer. And so I just let it go, and I kind of do stream of consciousness in the first draft. And then I just edit until I get what I want. And I think, and I tell my students this all the time. I mean, you don't really know. It's so important to write while you research too, because I can't really process my thoughts, or I don't really know what I'm arguing until I've written it. And so writing is just it's such an important part of how your mind works, that that just getting it out there and then continuing to read it until I figure out exactly what I'm saying and exactly what evidence makes sense and exactly what stories to tell. That's kind of a longer process. I'm definitely not the person who like writes perfect sentences at first. My early drafts are just for me. Nobody sees them. And if you did, you would probably laugh at them because some of it is really bad, but you just got to get it out there. It's like pulling teeth sometimes.
Great. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. And I'd like to say, once COVID eases, we would be delighted to have you come to campus and meet with students. I know community members here are aware of you and are deeply impressed with your work. And we could take a trip to Cairo and you could kind of show us what's happened and kind of a vivid field trip about just what has happened to this community and maybe what the way forward is.
John, this has been such an incredible conversation. Thank you. And that would be a dream for me. That would be an absolute dream. It looks like things are, at least by this fall are going to be more or less open. So I think whenever it's safe, I would be absolutely honored to come out and spend some real time there. I would love that.
Well, great. We will definitely. And I urge people, and this comes out next month, Elizabeth, or is it in May?
May, yeah.
I urge people to purchase it at your favorite bookseller because it's really an important and just kind of consciousness altering book. So please read it. Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Okay. Thanks all of you for joining another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We will have this interview on our website probably tomorrow. Please look at it, share it with friends, and continue to follow the Institute, where we keep the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.